The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table as Margaret Wellington struggled to remember her grandson's name. The silence stretched uncomfortably while 7 pairs of eyes watched her fumble with words that should have come naturally. Thomas Wellington leaned back in his chair, his expression a carefully crafted mixture of concern and disappointment. "Where are you watching this from tonight? I'd love to know in the comments below, especially if you've ever witnessed someone being underestimated in your own community." Margaret's trembling fingers reached for her wine glass, missing it entirely on the first attempt. At 67, she had always been the picture of elegance and intelligence, but tonight something felt different. Her silver hair, usually perfectly styled, seemed disheveled despite Rose's careful attention earlier. The navy blue dress that had always complemented her sharp blue eyes now seemed to hang loosely on her diminishing frame. Thomas exchanged a knowing glance with his wife Diana across the table. Diana's perfectly manicured nails tapped against her champagne flute as she watched Margaret with predatory patience. Their teenage children scrolled through their phones, oblivious to the subtle drama unfolding around the family dinner table. "This is Timothy, grandmother," Diana said with exaggerated patience. "Your grandson Timothy. He's 16 now, remember? He just got his driver's license last month." Margaret blinked several times, her confusion appearing genuine and heartbreaking. She looked at the young man as if seeing him for the first time, her weathered hands clasping and unclasping in her lap. Timothy shifted uncomfortably under his step-grandmother's vacant stare, his appetite disappearing entirely. "Of course," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle clink of silverware. "Timothy. I'm sorry, dear. Sometimes the names just slip away from me these days." Thomas pulled out his phone with practiced stealth, angling it to capture Margaret's confused expression. The screen showed he had been recording for several minutes already, documenting every moment of apparent cognitive decline. His thumb moved expertly across the device, adding timestamps and notes to what he privately called his evidence file. The dining room showcased the immense wealth that Margaret's deceased husband had accumulated over 4 decades of shrewd investments and business dealings. Original Monet paintings adorned the walls between built-in bookcases filled with first-edition literature. The Persian rugs beneath their feet cost more than most people's cars, and the antique furniture had been handpicked from European estates and auction houses. Thomas's eyes swept across the opulent room with barely concealed greed. Every piece represented money, and more importantly, money that should rightfully belong to him as the sole surviving heir. His father had been foolish to marry this woman 20 years ago, foolish to trust her with the family fortune when his mind started failing. Margaret attempted to cut her salmon, but her coordination seemed off. The knife slipped twice before she managed to separate a small piece. Rosa, the housekeeper who had served the family for 15 years, moved quietly from the kitchen doorway to assist, but Thomas raised his hand to stop her. "Let her try on her own, Rosa. Independence is important for someone in her condition." Rosa's dark eyes flashed with something between anger and confusion. She had worked closely with Margaret for years and had never witnessed such dramatic cognitive decline. Just that morning, Margaret had helped her calculate complex grocery budgets and had discussed the intricacies of the stock market with surprising clarity. Something about this performance felt wrong, but Rosa couldn't identify exactly what troubled her. Margaret's fork trembled as she brought the salmon to her mouth. A small piece fell onto her lap, staining the expensive fabric. She stared at the stain as if unable to comprehend how it had appeared, her expression vacant and lost. "Maybe we should consider getting some help around here," Thomas suggested to the table, his voice carrying just the right amount of reluctant concern. "Professional care. Someone trained to handle these situations." Diana nodded emphatically, her blonde hair catching the light as she leaned forward with feigned compassion. "It's becoming dangerous for her to live alone in this big house. What if she falls down those marble stairs? What if she forgets to turn off the gas stove?" Margaret's head snapped up at Diana's words, a flash of something sharp crossing her features before the confusion returned. She opened her mouth to speak, but seemed to forget what she wanted to say. Instead, she reached for her water glass and knocked over the salt shaker, sending white crystals scattering across the polished wood. "Oh my goodness," Margaret gasped, staring at the spilled salt as if it were a personal catastrophe. "I'm so sorry." I don't know what's wrong with me tonight. Thomas's phone captured every moment of apparent distress while he spoke in soothing tones about accidents happening to everyone. Internally, he calculated how this footage would play in front of a judge and a medical evaluation team. The combination of confusion, poor coordination, and memory loss painted a perfect picture of cognitive decline. After dinner, the family gathered in the living room where Margaret usually entertained guests with stories of her travels and her late husband's business adventures. Tonight, she sat quietly in her favorite armchair, staring into the fireplace with unfocused eyes. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, each note echoing through the uncomfortably silent room. Thomas began planting seeds with surgical precision, speaking loudly enough for Margaret to hear while pretending to have private conversations with other family members. He mentioned adult protective services, financial safeguards, and the importance of medical evaluations for elderly individuals showing signs of dementia. Margaret flinched at each carefully chosen phrase, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair until her knuckles turned white. When she finally excused herself to retire for the evening, she moved with the careful steps of someone navigating an unfamiliar world. Thomas watched her climb the stairs with satisfaction, already composing the phone call he would make to elder law attorney Richard Blackstone first thing Monday morning. The documentation he had gathered tonight, combined with the incidents he had been carefully orchestrating for weeks, would provide the foundation for emergency conservatorship proceedings. After Margaret disappeared into her bedroom suite, Thomas gathered his family and began the delicate process of preparing them for what he described as an inevitable and heartbreaking decision. He spoke about the burden of caring for aging relatives, the financial risks of allowing incompetent individuals to control vast estates, and the moral obligation to protect vulnerable family members from their own declining judgment. Diana supported every word with practiced emotion, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with an expensive handkerchief. She had married Thomas for his family's wealth and social status, and watching that security slip away due to an aging stepmother's mental decline was unacceptable. If legal proceedings could secure their financial future, she would support any narrative Thomas chose to construct. Margaret stood at her bedroom window, watching the family's cars pull away from the circular driveway. The confusion and vulnerability she had displayed during dinner vanished entirely, replaced by steely determination and razor-sharp focus. She moved to her private study, unlocking a hidden drawer in her antique desk to reveal files, recordings, and documentation that would have shocked Thomas into absolute silence. The performance had been exhausting but necessary. For months, she had been discovering financial irregularities in the family accounts, unauthorized transfers, and forged signatures that pointed to systematic theft. Playing the confused, declining widow had given her the perfect cover to gather evidence, while Thomas grew increasingly bold in his criminal activities. Margaret powered up her computer and opened encrypted files containing forensic accounting software that would have impressed corporate auditors. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency as she updated her detailed logs of Thomas's financial crimes. Every stolen dollar had been traced, every fraudulent transaction documented with precision that reflected decades of professional experience Thomas never knew she possessed. She reached for her secure phone and dialed a number she had memorized years ago. The voice that answered belonged to Jennifer Chun, one of the most respected forensic accountants in the state and Margaret's former colleague from her corporate consulting days. "Jennifer," Margaret said quietly, her voice now clear and commanding. "It's time to activate our plan. Thomas filed the conservatorship papers today, just as we predicted. Are you ready to show the court what real financial incompetence looks like?" Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray Seattle drizzle that made the city's glass towers appear to dissolve into the low-hanging clouds. Thomas Wellington adjusted his Italian silk tie as he strode through the polished marble lobby of Blackstone and Associates, one of the most prestigious elder law firms in the Pacific Northwest. His leather briefcase contained carefully edited recordings, doctored medical reports, and testimony from family members who believed they were protecting a beloved matriarch from her own declining mind. Richard Blackstone's corner office occupied the 32nd floor of the Columbia Center, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains. The attorney himself was a silver-haired man in his early 60s. His reputation built on decades of complex estate litigation and conservatorship cases that involved hundreds of millions of dollars. "Thomas," Richard said warmly, rising from behind his mahogany desk to shake hands. "I received your preliminary documentation over the weekend. This is indeed a troubling situation with your stepmother." Thomas settled into one of the butter-soft leather chairs facing Blackstone's desk, his expression carefully arranged to convey reluctant family duty rather than eager anticipation. He had practiced this performance for weeks, knowing that the attorney's assessment of his motivations would influence the entire legal strategy. "Richard, I want you to understand that this decision is breaking my heart. Margaret raised me after my mother passed away when I was 12. She's been like a real mother to me for over 30 years. But I cannot stand by and watch her destroy herself and everything my father built." Blackstone nodded sympathetically while reviewing the files spread across his desk. The documentation appeared comprehensive and professionally presented. Witness statements from family members described increasing confusion, memory loss, and poor judgment. Medical evaluations suggested cognitive decline consistent with early-stage dementia. Bank records showed erratic financial decisions and unexplained cash withdrawals totaling over $200,000 in the past 6 months. The recordings were particularly compelling evidence. Thomas had edited them skillfully, removing context and splicing together moments of genuine confusion with his own leading questions. Margaret's voice came through the speakers sounding lost, frightened, and unable to manage basic conversations about finances or daily activities. "These recordings were made during family dinners and casual visits," Thomas explained. "I started documenting her condition when I realized how serious the situation had become. You can hear how she struggles with simple concepts that she used to handle effortlessly." Blackstone listened to several minutes of audio evidence, making notes about specific instances of apparent cognitive impairment. The legal standard for conservatorship required clear and convincing evidence that the proposed ward lacked capacity to make informed decisions about their person or property. This documentation appeared to meet that threshold easily. "Thomas, I believe we have sufficient grounds to file for emergency conservatorship proceedings. Given the substantial estate involved and the evidence of declining capacity, I recommend we request immediate temporary guardianship pending full psychological evaluation." The attorney explained the process with practiced efficiency. Emergency petitions could be filed within 48 hours, especially when substantial assets were at risk due to an incompetent person's poor judgment. Medical evaluations would be conducted by court-appointed professionals, and a guardian ad litem would be assigned to represent Margaret's interests during the proceedings. "What about her current living situation?" Blackstone asked. "Is she safe in that large house by herself?" Thomas had anticipated this question and prepared his response carefully. "That's actually my biggest concern, Richard. Just last week, I found her wandering around the house at 3 in the morning, completely disoriented. She had turned on the gas stove and forgotten about it. The entire kitchen could have exploded if I hadn't discovered the situation." The fabrication rolled off his tongue with disturbing ease. In reality, Margaret had been working late in her study, analyzing financial records with the focused intensity of someone half her age. But Thomas needed dramatic examples of dangerous behavior to justify immediate intervention. "I think it would be appropriate for you to move into the house temporarily," Blackstone suggested. "Family supervision during this transition period would demonstrate our commitment to her safety and well-being. It would also give you opportunities to document any additional concerning behaviors." Thomas agreed enthusiastically while internally celebrating this unexpected advantage. Living in the mansion would give him direct access to Margaret's files, computers, and financial records. He could monitor her communications and prevent her from seeking independent legal counsel that might complicate the conservatorship proceedings. Meanwhile, across town, Dr. James Stevens reviewed the generous donation check that Thomas had delivered to his private clinic just 2 weeks earlier. The $50,000 contribution had been presented as a memorial gift in honor of Thomas's late father, but the timing struck Stevens as remarkably coincidental given the upcoming medical evaluation he had been asked to perform. Stevens had built his practice on wealthy clients who valued discretion and accommodation over strict ethical guidelines. His patient roster included prominent business leaders, political figures, and family members who required flexible interpretations of medical conditions for insurance claims, disability applications, and legal proceedings. The preliminary evaluation request from Blackstone's office provided clear guidance about the expected findings. Margaret Wellington was exhibiting signs of cognitive decline that rendered her incapable of managing complex financial affairs. The donation from her stepson demonstrated the family's commitment to quality medical care and their appreciation for thorough, professional assessments. Stevens scheduled the evaluation for Thursday morning, allowing sufficient time to review the legal documentation and prepare appropriate testing protocols. His report would need to support the conservatorship petition while maintaining the appearance of objective medical judgment. That same afternoon, Margaret received the legal papers through certified mail delivery. Rosa signed for the envelope while Margaret was in her study, working on what appeared to be complex mathematical calculations spread across multiple computer screens. The housekeeper's hands trembled as she read the formal notice of conservatorship proceedings. "Mrs. Wellington," Rosa called softly through the study door. "There are some legal papers here that require your immediate attention." Margaret emerged from her private workspace, looking genuinely startled and confused. She had been expecting the legal assault, but seeing the formal court documents still sent a chill through her carefully maintained composure. The petition described her as suffering from dementia, unable to care for herself, and requiring immediate protective intervention. Rosa watched Margaret's face crumble as she read through the allegations. The housekeeper had worked for the family long enough to recognize genuine distress, and Margaret's reaction appeared authentic and heartbreaking. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she struggled to comprehend how her own stepson could file such devastating claims about her mental capacity. "I don't understand, Rosa," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "How can Thomas say these things about me? I know I've been forgetful lately, but I'm not incompetent. I'm not crazy." Rosa wrapped her arms around Margaret's shoulders, offering comfort while struggling with her own confusion about the situation. She had observed Margaret daily for years and had never witnessed the severe cognitive decline described in the legal papers. Something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire situation. Thomas arrived at the mansion that evening with suitcases and moving boxes, explaining to Rosa that he would be staying temporarily to provide supervision and care during the legal proceedings. His wife Diana followed with their children, treating the move as a temporary inconvenience rather than a family crisis. Margaret retreated to her bedroom suite, overwhelmed by the invasion of her private space and the legal machinery grinding into motion around her. Thomas immediately began establishing new household rules, restricting Margaret's access to phones, computers, and financial documents under the guise of protecting her from making poor decisions. The transformation was swift and systematic. Thomas installed new locks on Margaret's study, claiming that important documents needed to be secured during the legal proceedings. He intercepted her mail, monitored her phone calls, and instructed Rosa to report any unusual behaviors or attempts to contact outside attorneys. Diana took control of meal planning and household management, treating Margaret like a guest in her own home rather than the legal owner of the property. The children occupied bedrooms that had served as guest quarters, their music and video games filling the normally quiet mansion with constant noise and disruption. Margaret felt increasingly trapped and isolated as Thomas controlled every aspect of her daily routine. He accompanied her to medical appointments, grocery shopping, and even short walks around the neighborhood. The man who had once called her mother now treated her like a dangerous child who required constant supervision. The psychological evaluation appointment with Dr. Stevens loomed ahead like an approaching storm. Margaret understood that his assessment would largely determine whether she retained control over her life and fortune or became a ward of the court under Thomas's guardianship. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her like a physical burden. Late at night, after Thomas's family had gone to sleep, Margaret lay awake in her bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her occupied house. She could hear Thomas moving around downstairs, probably searching through rooms he had never been allowed to access while her husband was alive. Every creak of the floorboards reminded her that her sanctuary had been invaded by people who viewed her as an obstacle to their financial security. What Thomas did not realize was that Margaret had been preparing for this exact scenario for months. The confused, declining woman he thought he was manipulating had actually orchestrated every move in their elaborate chess game. Her apparent vulnerability was the perfect disguise for gathering evidence of his crimes, and his arrogance would ultimately provide the rope for his own destruction. The legal assault had begun, but Thomas had chosen the wrong target for his carefully planned attack. The grandfather clock chimed 6 in the morning as Margaret slipped quietly from her bedroom, moving through the darkened hallway with surprising stealth for someone allegedly suffering from cognitive decline. Thomas and his family remained asleep in the guest wing, unaware that their supposedly confused victim was already awake and purposeful in her movements. Margaret made her way to the kitchen where Rosa was preparing breakfast, her steps confident and sure despite the early hour. The housekeeper looked up with genuine surprise at seeing her employer dressed and alert at such an unusual time. "Rosa," Margaret whispered, "could you help me with something important? I need to make a phone call, but Thomas has been monitoring the house line. Do you still have that cellular phone your daughter gave you?" Rosa nodded slowly, reaching into her apron pocket to retrieve a basic smartphone. She had been troubled by the dramatic changes in household dynamics since Thomas moved in, and Margaret's clear, focused demeanor this morning was starkly different from the confusion she had witnessed during recent family dinners. "Mrs. Wellington, you seem very different this morning. Are you feeling better?" Margaret's smile carried a hint of something that Rosa had never seen before, a sharpness, an intelligence that seemed almost predatory in its intensity. "I'm feeling exactly like myself, Rosa, perhaps more than I have in months." Margaret dialed a number from memory, her fingers moving across the phone with practiced efficiency. The call connected after 2 rings, and Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as she spoke to someone identified only as Jonathan. "Jonathan, it's Margaret Wellington. I need you to activate the secondary protocols we discussed. Thomas filed the conservatorship papers yesterday, exactly as we predicted." "Yes, I have all the documentation ready. Can you meet me at the usual location this afternoon?" Rosa busied herself with coffee preparation, but her ears were attuned to every word of the mysterious conversation. Margaret was speaking with the clarity and authority of someone conducting complex business negotiations, not the rambling confusion of a woman losing her mental faculties. After ending the call, Margaret returned the phone to Rosa with a grateful squeeze of her hand. "What you've witnessed this morning needs to remain between us, Rosa. There are things happening that Thomas doesn't understand, and his ignorance is going to cost him everything he thinks he's about to gain." Later that morning, while Thomas reviewed legal strategies with his attorney via conference call, Margaret sat in the sunroom working on what appeared to be a complex crossword puzzle. Rosa brought her coffee and noticed that the puzzle was actually filled with numbers, equations, and financial calculations rather than words. The mathematical work spread across multiple pages showed sophisticated analysis of investment portfolios, compound interest calculations, and risk assessment models. Margaret's handwriting was precise and confident as she worked through problems that would challenge professional financial analysts. When Thomas finished his phone call and joined Margaret in the sunroom, she quickly covered her work with a decorative magazine, immediately adopting the confused, vulnerable demeanor she had been displaying for weeks. Her transformation was so complete and convincing that even Rosa questioned what she had witnessed earlier. "Good morning, Margaret," Thomas said with exaggerated cheerfulness. "How are you feeling today? Did you sleep well?" Margaret looked at him with apparent confusion, as if struggling to remember who he was or why he might be asking about her sleep. The contrast between her earlier sharpness and current bewilderment was so dramatic that Rosa wondered if she had imagined the morning's conversation entirely. "I'm fine, dear," Margaret replied in a voice that seemed smaller and more uncertain than the commanding tone Rosa had heard just hours earlier. "Though I'm still not sure why you're staying here. Is there something wrong with your house?" Thomas exchanged a meaningful glance with Diana, who had entered the room carrying legal documents that needed Margaret's signature. They interpreted her confusion as further evidence of cognitive decline, unaware that every word and gesture was being carefully calculated for maximum effect. "We're just here to help, grandmother," Diana said with patronizing sweetness. "You've been having some difficulties lately, and we want to make sure you're safe and properly cared for." Margaret nodded vaguely, but Rosa noticed a brief flash of something sharp and angry cross her features before the vacant expression returned. It was becoming clear that Margaret was playing a role, but the purpose and extent of her deception remained mysterious. That afternoon, Margaret announced that she needed to visit her late husband's grave, a weekly ritual she had maintained for the past 5 years. Thomas insisted on accompanying her, claiming concern for her safety and well-being. What he didn't realize was that Margaret had been counting on his protective surveillance to provide the perfect cover for her real destination. The cemetery visit was brief and genuinely emotional, with Margaret spending several minutes at her husband's graveside speaking in whispers that Thomas couldn't quite hear. When they returned to the car, Margaret appeared tired and disoriented, requiring Thomas's assistance to fasten her seatbelt properly. However, Margaret directed Thomas to make a stop at what she claimed was her late husband's favorite coffee shop, a small establishment in downtown Seattle that she said held sentimental value. Thomas agreed, viewing the detour as an opportunity to demonstrate his patient, caring supervision to potential witnesses. Inside the coffee shop, Margaret excused herself to use the restroom, moving with the slow, uncertain steps of someone navigating an unfamiliar environment. Thomas ordered their beverages and settled into a corner table, scrolling through his phone while monitoring the restroom entrance. What Thomas didn't realize was that the coffee shop's layout included a rear exit that connected to an adjacent office building. Margaret had used this route dozens of times over the past months to attend secret meetings with her professional network. Her supposed bathroom break was actually a 15-minute conference with Jonathan Myers, her late husband's financial advisor and longtime family friend. Jonathan had been deeply troubled by the financial irregularities Margaret had discovered in the family accounts. As someone who had managed the Wellington family investments for over 20 years, he recognized the sophisticated theft patterns that Thomas had been implementing with increasing boldness. "Margaret," Jonathan whispered urgently in the private conference room they had borrowed, "I've completed the forensic analysis of the account transfers you documented. Thomas has stolen over $2 million using forged signatures and fraudulent authorizations. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming." Margaret nodded grimly, her demeanor completely transformed from the confused woman Thomas believed he was supervising. "Have you contacted Jennifer Chun about conducting the official audit? She's standing by, ready to present findings to the court whenever you give the signal." "Margaret, the sophistication of your documentation has impressed even our most experienced forensic accountants. Thomas has no idea what kind of professional he's chosen to target." When Margaret returned to the coffee shop's main area, she was once again the uncertain, fragile woman who required assistance with simple tasks. Thomas helped her to their table and noted with satisfaction how other customers observed his patient, caring attention to his elderly stepmother's needs. The drive home provided additional opportunities for Margaret to demonstrate apparent confusion about familiar routes and landmarks. She asked Thomas to remind her of street names she had known for decades and seemed genuinely lost in neighborhoods where she had lived for 20 years. Back at the mansion, Margaret retreated to her bedroom for what she announced was an afternoon nap. Thomas used this time to search through her personal belongings, looking for additional evidence of cognitive decline or financial mismanagement he could present to the court. What Thomas discovered in Margaret's desk drawers and personal files confused him significantly. Complex financial documents showed sophisticated analysis and planning that seemed inconsistent with dementia or cognitive impairment. Computer printouts contained detailed investment strategies and tax planning calculations that would challenge professional advisors. Thomas dismissed these findings as outdated materials from Margaret's marriage to his father, assuming that someone else had prepared the analysis years earlier. His arrogance prevented him from considering the possibility that Margaret herself possessed the expertise to create such sophisticated financial documentation. Meanwhile, Margaret lay in her bed listening to Thomas move around her private study, accessing files and documents with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won their battle. Every drawer he opened, every paper he examined was exactly what she had intended for him to find. The psychological evaluation with Dr. Stevens was scheduled for the following morning, and Margaret understood that his assessment would determine whether her carefully orchestrated plan succeeded or failed. The performance would need to be flawless, convincing enough to satisfy Thomas's expectations, while providing the foundation for his ultimate destruction. As evening approached, Margaret joined the family for dinner, once again displaying the confusion and vulnerability that had convinced them all of her declining mental state. She struggled with simple conversations, forgot familiar names, and required assistance with tasks she had managed independently for decades. Thomas documented every moment with his phone, building what he believed was an irrefutable case for conservatorship. His confidence grew with each passing hour, unaware that Margaret's apparent weakness was actually the most dangerous weapon she had ever wielded against him. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Seattle's skyline shimmer against the backdrop of Mount Rainier. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Thomas's BMW as they drove toward Dr. Stevens's clinic, her hands folded in her lap with the apparent resignation of someone accepting their fate. Thomas hummed quietly to himself, confident that today's psychological evaluation would provide the final piece of documentation needed to secure conservatorship. What Thomas didn't know was that Margaret had spent the previous evening in secure communication with Harold Fitzgerald, the family attorney who had drawn up her late husband's original trust documents and estate planning materials. Fitzgerald had been deeply disturbed by Margaret's carefully coded message requesting an emergency consultation about financial irregularities and potential elder abuse. The meeting had taken place at midnight in Fitzgerald's downtown office, accessed through a service entrance that allowed Margaret to avoid detection by Thomas's surveillance. What Fitzgerald discovered during that clandestine conference fundamentally altered his understanding of both Margaret's capabilities and Thomas's criminal activities. "Harold," Margaret had said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk with the commanding presence of someone conducting high-level business negotiations. "I need you to understand something that will shock you, but I've maintained my CPA license and consulting practice throughout my entire marriage to William." Fitzgerald's surprise was evident as Margaret continued her revelation. "For 20 years, I've provided financial consulting services to Fortune 500 companies under my maiden name through a discreet professional network. My specialty has always been forensic accounting and fraud detection." Thomas chose the wrong woman to steal from. Margaret opened an encrypted laptop that she had concealed in an oversized handbag, revealing financial analysis software that would have impressed corporate auditing teams. The screen displayed 40 years of meticulously documented family business dealings, investment strategies, and tax planning initiatives that showcased expertise far beyond anything Thomas could have imagined. Every transaction, every investment decision, every financial move that William made was actually developed through our partnership, Margaret explained. "I was never just the wealthy wife. I was the architect of everything Thomas thinks he's about to inherit." The documentation spread across Fitzgerald's desk painted a devastating picture of Thomas's criminal activities. Bank records showed systematic theft dating back over 2 years, with increasingly bold fraudulent transfers as Thomas grew confident in his ability to manipulate what he believed was an incompetent victim. Margaret's files contained recorded conversations where Thomas had admitted to forging signatures, falsifying financial statements, and planning the conservatorship as a method of legalizing his access to family assets. The sophistication of her evidence gathering reflected decades of professional experience in financial investigation and corporate fraud detection. "Harold, I need you to contact Jennifer Chen immediately. She's the forensic accountant who worked with me on the Pemberton Industries embezzlement case 5 years ago. Jennifer owes me several favors, and I'm ready to collect on all of them." Jennifer Chun answered her phone on the first ring despite the late hour, recognizing Fitzgerald's number from previous collaborations on complex estate litigation. When she learned that Margaret Wellington was requesting her assistance, her response was immediate and unequivocal. "Margaret saved my career when the Pemberton case nearly destroyed my reputation," Jennifer told Fitzgerald. "If someone is targeting her for financial abuse, they're about to discover what happens when you attack one of the most respected forensic accountants on the West Coast." Jennifer agreed to conduct a comprehensive audit pro bono, mobilizing her team of investigators and analysts to begin examining the Wellington family accounts immediately. The scope of documentation that Margaret had already compiled would accelerate their analysis by months, providing detailed roadmaps to every fraudulent transaction Thomas had attempted. While Margaret underwent her psychological evaluation with the compromised Dr. Stevens, Jennifer's team was systematically dismantling Thomas's financial crimes with surgical precision. Bank records, investment statements, and transaction logs revealed a pattern of theft so extensive and well-documented that criminal prosecution would be inevitable. Margaret's performance during the psychological evaluation was masterful, displaying just enough confusion to satisfy Dr. Stevens's predetermined conclusions while avoiding any statements that could be used against her in future legal proceedings. She answered questions with carefully calculated inconsistency, sometimes demonstrating sharp intelligence before seeming to lose focus entirely. Dr. Stevens, influenced by Thomas's financial contributions and guided by the legal documentation suggesting cognitive decline, interpreted Margaret's responses through the lens of his expected findings. His evaluation would support the conservatorship petition while Margaret's professional network prepared to destroy Thomas with evidence of systematic fraud. That afternoon, while Thomas celebrated what he believed was a successful medical evaluation, Margaret's encrypted communications system activated a network of professionals who had worked with her for decades. Corporate lawyers, financial investigators, and forensic accountants began coordinating a response that would expose Thomas's crimes with devastating completeness. Jennifer Chin's preliminary analysis revealed that Thomas had stolen over $2,300,000 through forged signatures, unauthorized wire transfers, and manipulated investment liquidations. The theft had been systematic and sophisticated, but Margaret's documentation had captured every fraudulent transaction with prosecutorial precision. Margaret's apparent confusion and memory lapses had actually been her method of investigating Thomas's crimes while maintaining the perfect cover of cognitive decline. Every time she seemed lost or disoriented, she had been gathering evidence, documenting conversations, and building an irrefutable case against her stepson. The seemingly random asset liquidations that Thomas had interpreted as signs of financial incompetence were actually strategic moves designed to prevent further theft. Margaret had been systematically protecting family assets by moving them into accounts that Thomas couldn't access, using her professional expertise to stay one step ahead of his increasingly desperate schemes. Thomas returned home that evening convinced that Dr. Stevens's evaluation would support emergency conservatorship proceedings. He began making plans to liquidate additional family assets, believing that Margaret's declining mental state provided legal justification for aggressive financial management. What Thomas didn't realize was that Margaret's professional network had been monitoring his activities for months, documenting every crime and preparing for the moment when his arrogance would provide the perfect opportunity for justice. His confidence in his own superiority had blinded him to the sophisticated opposition he faced. Margaret joined the family for dinner, once again displaying the confused vulnerability that had convinced Thomas of his inevitable victory. She struggled with simple conversations, forgot familiar details, and required assistance with basic tasks. Thomas documented every moment, building what he believed was conclusive evidence of her incompetence. Meanwhile, Jennifer Chin worked through the night with her team of forensic investigators, preparing a comprehensive audit that would expose Thomas's crimes with mathematical certainty. The evidence Margaret had gathered over months of careful investigation provided the foundation for criminal charges that would destroy Thomas's freedom, reputation, and financial security. Rosa observed Margaret's evening routine with growing confusion about the dramatic inconsistencies in her employer's behavior. The sharp, commanding woman who had made mysterious phone calls and conducted complex calculations seemed to transform completely whenever Thomas was present. Margaret retreated to her bedroom, knowing that the next phase of her carefully orchestrated plan was about to begin. Thomas believed he was on the verge of legal victory, unaware that his target had been preparing for his destruction with the methodical precision of someone who had spent 40 years detecting and exposing financial fraud. The psychological evaluation that Thomas viewed as his triumph would actually become the foundation for his complete downfall. Margaret's professional network was now fully activated, armed with devastating evidence and motivated by decades of personal loyalty to a woman who had helped them all achieve success in their careers. Jennifer Chin sent her final message of the evening to Harold Fitzgerald, confirming that the forensic audit was complete and ready for presentation to both civil and criminal courts. Thomas Wellington's systematic theft had been documented with such overwhelming precision that his conviction was virtually guaranteed. Margaret lay in her bed listening to Thomas and Diana celebrate what they believed was their impending financial windfall. Their voices carried through the mansion's walls as they planned how to spend money that would never belong to them. The irony was perfect, and Margaret allowed herself a small smile as she contemplated the justice that awaited them all. The King County Superior Court erupted in stunned silence as Jennifer Chen stood before Judge Patricia Morrison with a leather-bound document that would reshape everything Thomas Wellington believed about his impending victory. The forensic accountant's reputation preceded her into the courtroom, but nothing could have prepared the assembled legal teams for the devastating precision of her 200-page audit report. "Your Honor," Jennifer began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had testified in dozens of high-stakes financial fraud cases. "This conservatorship petition is based on fraudulent claims designed to conceal systematic theft by the petitioner himself. Margaret Wellington is not only mentally competent, she is one of the most respected forensic accountants on the West Coast." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as Jennifer continued her presentation. The woman he had dismissed as a declining, confused victim had apparently been documenting his every crime with mathematical precision that would have impressed federal investigators. Mrs. Wellington maintained her CPA license throughout her 20-year marriage and operated a discreet consulting practice specializing in corporate fraud detection. Her client list includes Microsoft, Boeing, and Starbucks. She has personally investigated embezzlement cases totaling over $500 million in stolen assets. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical force. Thomas's attorney, Richard Blackstone, stared at his client with growing horror as he realized the extent to which he had been deceived and potentially implicated in criminal fraud. Diana's perfectly composed facade cracked entirely as she grasped the implications of what they were hearing. Judge Morrison leaned forward with intense interest as Jennifer opened her laptop and connected it to the courtroom's display system. The first document that appeared on screen was a forensic analysis showing $2,300,000 in fraudulent transactions, each one traced with surgical precision to Thomas's unauthorized activities. These bank records demonstrate that Mr. Wellington systematically forged his stepmother's signature on 37 separate occasions. Jennifer explained as damning evidence filled the courtroom's monitors. Each forged signature has been verified by independent handwriting experts and compared to authentic samples from Mrs. Wellington's professional correspondence. The signature analysis was devastating in its clarity. Side-by-side comparisons showed obvious differences between Margaret's authentic signatures and Thomas's clumsy forgeries. The progression of forged documents revealed increasing boldness as Thomas grew confident that his confused victim would never discover his theft. Thomas tried to maintain his composure as Jennifer methodically destroyed his credibility with overwhelming documentation. Investment liquidations he had claimed were evidence of Margaret's cognitive decline were revealed as strategic asset protection measures designed to prevent further theft. Mrs. Wellington discovered the initial fraudulent transactions 8 months ago and began what she calls Operation Golden Years, a comprehensive investigation designed to document every aspect of Mr. Wellington's criminal activities while maintaining the appearance of cognitive decline. The encrypted video files that Jennifer presented next were perhaps the most shocking evidence yet revealed. Security cameras that Thomas had never noticed captured him in Margaret's study, photographing confidential documents and searching through files he had no legal right to access. Even more damaging were the audio recordings Margaret had made using professional surveillance equipment. Thomas's voice filled the courtroom as he bragged to Diana about manipulating his stepmother's apparent confusion and planning to liquidate family assets once the conservatorship was approved. "This is almost too easy," Thomas's recorded voice said with obvious satisfaction. "The old woman has no idea what's happening to her own money. Once I have legal guardianship, I can sell everything and blame it on her medical expenses." Diana's sharp intake of breath was audible throughout the courtroom as her husband's criminal admissions played for everyone to hear. The recordings captured months of conversations where Thomas detailed his theft, his manipulation of medical evaluations, and his plans for systematic asset stripping once legal control was established. Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence mounted. Dr. Stevens, the compromised medical evaluator, had been contacted by the court and had already admitted to accepting bribes in exchange for predetermined assessment results. His confession implicated Thomas in witness tampering and medical fraud charges that would carry significant prison sentences. Your Honor, Jennifer continued, Mrs. Wellington's apparent confusion was actually her method of gathering evidence while investigating sophisticated financial crimes. Every moment of seeming cognitive decline was carefully calculated to provide cover for her forensic accounting work. The courtroom watched in fascination as Jennifer displayed Margaret's professional workspace, revealed through photographs that showed multiple computer monitors, advanced financial analysis software, and detailed investigation files that would have impressed FBI forensic teams. The complexity and sophistication of her work demonstrated intellectual capacity that completely contradicted Thomas's claims of dementia. Richard Blackstone rose shakily to his feet, his face pale with the realization that his client had committed perjury on a massive scale. Your Honor, I need to request an immediate recess to consult with my client about these unexpected revelations. I was not aware of the extent of the evidence against Mr. Wellington's claims. The attorney's distress was obvious to everyone in the courtroom. He had built his reputation on ethical practice and had unknowingly become complicit in criminal fraud through Thomas's systematic deception. His request to withdraw from the case would be granted, but the damage to his professional standing was already significant. Thomas sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of his situation became clear. Margaret had not only discovered his theft, but had been systematically documenting his crimes with the expertise of someone who had spent 4 decades detecting corporate fraud. Every conversation, every forged signature, every unauthorized transaction had been captured and analyzed with prosecutorial precision. Family members who had supported Thomas's conservatorship petition began whispering among themselves as they realized how thoroughly they had been manipulated. Margaret's apparent decline had seemed so genuine that even people who knew her well had been convinced of her cognitive impairment. The recordings revealed Thomas's desperation about gambling debts and failed business ventures that had motivated his increasingly bold theft. His financial situation was far worse than anyone had realized, with creditors threatening foreclosure and bankruptcy proceedings that would have left him destitute without access to family money. Jennifer's presentation concluded with a detailed timeline showing how Thomas's crimes had escalated over 2 years, from small unauthorized transfers to major investment liquidations worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The pattern demonstrated systematic criminal enterprise rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment. Mrs. Wellington's investigation has provided sufficient evidence for criminal prosecution on multiple felony counts, Jennifer announced to the silent courtroom. Wire fraud, elder abuse, forgery, perjury, and conspiracy charges are all supported by overwhelming documentation that she compiled while allowing Mr. Wellington to believe he was successfully deceiving her. Thomas's world collapsed entirely as he grasped the sophisticated trap that Margaret had constructed around him. His apparent victim had actually been the architect of his destruction, using professional expertise he never knew existed to build an irrefutable case that would destroy his freedom, his family, and his future. Judge Morrison's voice cut through the stunned silence with judicial authority that left no room for negotiation. This conservatorship petition is dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Wellington, you are hereby ordered to appear before this court next week to face formal criminal charges. Bailiff, please ensure that Mr. Wellington understands he is not to leave the jurisdiction pending further proceedings. Thomas's legs felt weak as the reality of his situation crystallized with devastating clarity. Margaret had outplayed him completely, using his own arrogance and prejudice against him while gathering evidence that would send him to federal prison. The woman he had dismissed as a confused, declining victim had been planning his destruction with methodical precision that reflected 40 years of professional expertise. The courtroom began to empty as Thomas sat motionless in his chair, contemplating the ruins of everything he had tried to steal and the prison sentence that awaited him. Judge Patricia Morrison's gavel struck the bench with finality that echoed through the packed courtroom like thunder. The conservatorship petition filed by Thomas Wellington is dismissed with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, this court finds clear and convincing evidence of criminal fraud, elder abuse, and systematic theft that will be immediately referred to both state and federal prosecutors for criminal prosecution. Thomas sat frozen in his chair as the full weight of his destruction settled around him like concrete. The woman he had dismissed as a confused, declining victim had orchestrated the most sophisticated legal ambush he could have imagined. Margaret Wellington rose from her seat in the gallery, no longer displaying any trace of the confusion and vulnerability that had defined her performance for 8 months. "Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice carrying the clear authority of someone who had spent 40 years commanding corporate boardrooms and federal courthouses, "I would like to address the court regarding the systematic crimes that have been perpetrated against me and my late husband's estate." Judge Morrison nodded with obvious respect as Margaret approached the witness stand. The transformation was so complete and dramatic that several family members gasped audibly. This was not the confused, fragile woman they had been protecting. This was a legal and financial professional whose expertise had been deliberately concealed to expose criminal fraud. "I want this court to understand that every moment of apparent confusion, every instance of seeming cognitive decline, was a carefully calculated performance designed to document systematic theft while protecting my safety and gathering irrefutable evidence of criminal activity." Margaret's statement revealed the sophisticated trap she had constructed around Thomas with methodical precision. The security cameras he had never noticed, the audio recordings he never suspected, and the forensic documentation that captured every fraudulent transaction had all been part of an investigation conducted by one of the most respected fraud detection specialists on the West Coast. Thomas watched in horror as Margaret detailed the extent of her deception. She had maintained professional relationships with forensic accountants, federal investigators, and legal experts throughout her marriage, consulting on high-profile fraud cases while Thomas assumed she spent her time arranging flowers and attending charity luncheons. "My husband William knew about my professional work and supported my decision to maintain my CPA license and consulting practice. Together, we built the financial strategies and investment portfolios that Thomas believed he could steal without consequence. Every asset he attempted to liquidate, every signature he forged, every fraudulent transaction he initiated was documented with prosecutorial precision." The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Margaret revealed the sophisticated network of professionals who had assisted her investigation. Jennifer Chin's forensic audit was merely the culmination of months of evidence gathering that involved banking experts, handwriting analysts, surveillance specialists, and legal advisors who had worked with Margaret for decades. Thomas had made the fatal error of underestimating his target based on age and gender stereotypes. The woman he viewed as a vulnerable victim was actually a financial predator whose expertise in fraud detection had helped major corporations recover hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen assets. "Your Honor," Margaret continued, "I want the court to understand that Thomas's gambling debts and failed business ventures created financial desperation that motivated increasingly bold criminal activities. His plan was to use conservatorship proceedings to legalize theft that had already been occurring for over 2 years. The evidence presented by Jennifer Chun had painted a devastating picture of Thomas's financial situation. Creditors were demanding payment on gambling debts totaling over $800,000, and his attempted real estate investments had failed spectacularly, leaving him facing bankruptcy and foreclosure on his own home. Thomas had viewed Margaret's apparent cognitive decline as divine intervention that would solve his financial problems through legal theft disguised as protective guardianship. His arrogance had prevented him from recognizing the sophisticated opposition he faced from someone whose professional expertise far exceeded his own amateur criminal efforts. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and comprehensive. All of Thomas's assets would be frozen pending criminal trial, and restitution proceedings would begin immediately to recover stolen family funds. Emergency protective orders would prevent any further contact between Thomas and Margaret, and his passport would be confiscated to prevent flight from prosecution. "Thomas Wellington, you are hereby ordered to surrender yourself to federal marshals for processing on charges of wire fraud, elder abuse, forgery, perjury, conspiracy, and money laundering. Your bail is set at $5 million, secured by property that this court has determined you obtained through fraudulent means. Thomas's legs buckled as he realized the impossibility of making bail. His stolen funds had already been frozen, his legitimate assets were insufficient to cover the bond amount, and no family member would be willing to risk their own property for someone who had systematically deceived them all. Diana Wellington's reaction was immediate and decisive. She approached the court clerk to file emergency divorce papers that had been prepared weeks earlier by attorneys who specialized in protecting innocent spouses from criminal liability. Her marriage to Thomas had become a legal and financial liability that she would not tolerate. I want everyone to understand that I had no knowledge of my husband's criminal activities, Diana announced to the assembled media representatives who had packed the courtroom gallery. I will be cooperating fully with federal investigators and pursuing my own claims for damages related to Thomas's fraudulent misrepresentation of our family's financial situation. Rosa, the housekeeper who had witnessed Margaret's elaborate performance, stood near the courtroom exit with tears of admiration streaming down her face. She had suspected something unusual about Margaret's condition, but could never have imagined the sophisticated investigation that had been conducted under the cover of apparent cognitive decline. "Mrs. Wellington," Rosa whispered as Margaret passed by, "you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. The way you protected yourself and caught him was absolutely brilliant." Margaret smiled warmly at the woman who had unknowingly assisted her investigation by providing secure communications and transportation to secret meetings. Rosa's loyalty and discretion had been essential components of the successful operation against Thomas's criminal enterprise. 6 months later, Margaret stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Washington Law School, addressing an audience of attorneys, financial professionals, and law enforcement officials about elder financial abuse prevention. The Wellington Foundation for Elder Protection had become a nationally recognized organization that provided resources and expertise to families facing financial predation. The foundation's mission reflected Margaret's professional expertise and personal experience with systematic fraud. Educational programs taught elderly individuals and their families how to recognize warning signs of financial abuse, and legal clinics provided support for victims of elder exploitation. Thomas Wellington had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple felony charges rather than face the overwhelming evidence that Margaret's investigation had compiled. His conviction had become a landmark case study in elder abuse prosecution and forensic accounting techniques. Margaret's speaking engagements took her across the country and internationally to conferences focused on financial crime prevention and investigation. Her story had inspired legislative changes that strengthened protections for elderly individuals and improved training for law enforcement agencies dealing with elder abuse cases. The mansion that Thomas had briefly occupied as he planned his theft was now a training center for financial investigators and elder protection advocates. Margaret had converted the property into a facility where professionals could learn sophisticated fraud detection techniques and evidence-gathering methods. Diana's divorce had been finalized within 3 months, with the court awarding her minimal assets due to the fraudulent nature of Thomas's financial claims during their marriage. She had relocated to another state with their children, seeking to distance herself from the criminal investigation and media attention surrounding Thomas's prosecution. Thomas's children had legally changed their names and refused all contact with their imprisoned father. His systematic deception had destroyed not only his freedom and financial security, but also his relationships with everyone who had once trusted and respected him. Margaret traveled extensively for her foundation work, speaking at conferences in London, Tokyo, and Sydney about financial crime prevention and the psychological tactics that predators use against elderly victims. Her expertise was sought by government agencies, international law enforcement organizations, and academic institutions studying elder abuse patterns. The irony of Thomas's situation was particularly satisfying to Margaret and the professional network that had supported her investigation. A man who had planned to steal millions through legal guardianship was now serving time in federal prison, while his intended victim had become an internationally recognized expert in financial crime prevention. Rosa had been promoted to estate manager and foundation administrator, overseeing the day-to-day operations of Margaret's expanded professional activities. Her loyalty during the investigation had earned her a permanent position with substantial salary increases and benefits that reflected her essential contributions to the successful operation. Thomas's former attorney, Richard Blackstone, had faced disciplinary proceedings for his failure to detect obvious signs of client fraud. His reputation had been permanently damaged by his association with the case, and several major clients had terminated their relationships with his firm due to concerns about professional judgment. Dr. Stevens had lost his medical license and faced criminal charges for accepting bribes and falsifying psychological evaluations. His conviction had led to reviews of other cases where his assessments had influenced legal proceedings, and several of his former patients had filed malpractice lawsuits seeking damages for fraudulent medical opinions. Margaret's story had become required reading in law schools and medical schools as an example of how professional arrogance and stereotypical thinking could be exploited by sophisticated victims seeking justice against criminal predation. Her techniques were studied by federal investigators as models for effective evidence gathering in complex financial fraud cases. The family gathering that had once showcased Margaret's apparent cognitive decline was now an annual celebration of her foundation's achievements and the successful prosecution of elder abuse cases across the country. Family members who had been deceived by Thomas's manipulation expressed their admiration for Margaret's brilliant strategy and professional expertise. Margaret's final victory came during Thomas's parole hearing 8 years later, when she testified via video conference about the lasting impact of his crimes and the importance of protecting elderly individuals from financial predation. Her statement helped ensure that his parole application was denied, extending his imprisonment for additional years. The woman Thomas had dismissed as a confused, vulnerable target had become his nemesis and the architect of his complete destruction. Margaret Wellington's combination of professional expertise, strategic thinking, and Oscar-worthy acting ability had created one of the most sophisticated justice operations in elder abuse prosecution history. Thomas remained in federal prison, stripped of his freedom, his family, his assets, and his reputation. Margaret traveled the world as a respected expert, using her experience to protect other elderly individuals from the kind of predation that he had attempted to perpetrate against her.